Well, hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Charlene O'Hanlon. I'm the moderator for today's webinar, which is What is DevOps? Defining an Industry Standard. We have a webinar today that is different from our normal webinar. Normally, we just have a bunch of slides on the screen and we talk in disconnected voices, but today you actually get to see our faces. So we have a panel of 5 really great guys today who are so knowledgeable in the industry, and I'm sure they're going to be imparting some really great information. But before we get to that, I do have a couple housekeeping things I do need to let you know about. So today's webinar is being recorded, as always. If you miss any or all of this webinar, it should be available via a recording in about 24 hours after the fact. So if you signed up via email, you will receive an email link to it. Otherwise, it will be on the devops.com website. And also, we will be taking questions from the audience close to the end of our discussion. So if you have a question for any of our panelists today, please go ahead and submit your questions at any time. And then we're going to take about 15 minutes or so near the end of the presentation today to go over the audience questions. And hopefully we'll be able to get to all the questions, but if not, I'm sure our panelists will be more than happy to follow up after the webinar at some point. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to it. Today's webinar is What is DevOps? Defining an Industry Standard, and it's going to be a spirited conversation among 5 wonderful panelists. The first one is Brian Dawson, who is the DevOps evangelist at CloudBees and no stranger to DevOps.com. Welcome, Brian. How are you? Brian, are you with us?
I am. I just had to find the mute button. Hello, Charlene.
Right.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. Our next panelist is Anand Akela, who is the Senior Director Product Marketing for DevOps and Cloud Solutions at CA Technologies. Anand, how are you today?
Thanks, Charlene. I'm good. And as you could see today, I'm sitting in a room with halo effect on. So hopefully some wisdom will come out and share with everyone over here.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I am going to actually switch over to you guys can see see everybody, right? Because for some reason on my screen it's not showing everybody. I'm going to just check and see if I can.
We can, yeah.
Oh, good. Mm-hmm. See everybody? Okay, all right, great. So sorry about that. So our next panelist then is Sunil Pillai, and Sunil, I apologize if I got the pronunciation of your last name incorrect, but your title is Director of InfoStretch Labs at InfoStretch, and welcome to today's webinar, Sunil. How you doing?
Thank you, Charlene. I'm doing great and delighted to be here, and you got my last name perfect, actually. So.
Oh, perfect. Yay. All right. Oh, then it's a personal accomplishment for me.
Yep.
Okay, great. So our next presenter then is Luboš Parobek, and I'm sure I didn't get that last name correct. But Luboš is Vice President of Product at Sauce Labs. Luboš, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you.
Good, great. How'd I do on the last name?
Pretty good. Not too bad.
Okay, all right. So our final panelist today is Carl Kamm, who's Technical Product Marketing Manager at Puppet, which everybody knows Puppet. How are you, Carl?
Doing great. Excited to be here.
Good. Excellent. Excellent. So I would like everybody to just take a second or so, give the audience just a real short introduction, you know, who you are, what you do, how you're connected to DevOps. And so, Brian, why don't we go ahead and get started with you?
Okay, so as you introduced me, Charlene, I'm Brian Dawson. I work for a company called CloudBees as a DevOps evangelist. I always like to clarify that a bit and say I'm a DevOps evangelist and practitioner, because I hate to, give up all of the experience I feel I've accumulated, or the bumps and bruises that I've gotten. Quick background is, I come here by way of being a development manager, and then most recently I worked as the director of an enterprise agile transformation practice, services practice, where we helped companies, small and actually mostly large and enterprise settings, implement continuous integration, continuous delivery, and DevOps. So I have a passion based on that, and earlier in my career, a passion on really optimizing software development, and I'm hoping I can bring some value to the discussion today.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. Anand, why don't you give us a short introduction of yourself?
Sure. So I lead DevOps solution strategy and marketing at CA, and working with the cross-functional organization to come up with a good solution across the software lifecycle. We have tools for development, testing, operations, and monitoring, and my team works with all of them to come up with solution messages, tools, and best practices to share with our customers.
Perfect. All right, Sunil, give us a
Sure,
little.
thanks, Charlene. Absolutely. So I'm Sunil. I'm the director for InfoStretch Labs at InfoStretch. So InfoStretch is essentially a digital-first professional services company, and DevOps is a big practice for us. So I help guide the innovation in InfoStretch, and also lead the DevOps practice here.
Excellent. Lubash?
Hi, I'm Lubosh Porobek. I'm the VP of Product at Sauce Labs. At Sauce Labs, we help organizations make the DevOps journey by helping them with their automated testing. In particular, we offer a platform for automated functional testing in the cloud. And I'm hoping to share some of the learnings that I've acquired by working with our customers over the last few years.
Great, thanks. And Carl?
Yeah, I do technical product marketing at Puppet. I actually have a very similar background to Brian. I'm a recovering sysadmin and developer, and using that background to advance all of the great DevOps practices that Puppet is helping to bring to the market.
Okay, great. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. I'm sure the audience does as well. So why don't we go ahead and jump into the conversation? So we're looking at exactly what is DevOps, and whether it actually can be defined by any particular industry standards. And so I thought it probably would be best to actually kind of talk about defining DevOps. So Brian, how do you actually define DevOps? Because I know you've got a lot of experience with real world practitioners, and so I thought you might have a really decent handle on how you go about defining it.
I definitely am never short of an opinion. So I expect this to be sort of a source for good discussion. I do like to say that, if it's one of those where if you ask 10 different people how to define DevOps, you tend to get 9 different answers. Though I do believe that a couple of things. For a long time, when DevOps was introduced, there was probably that wider spread, 10 different people, 9 different answers. I do feel that we're kind of starting to stabilize on a definition, and I feel that the definition has shifted and changed since it was originally introduced. So where I arrive at is I look at DevOps as really being about culture, or more specifically, it's a set of tenets that you ascribe to or aspire to. And those tenets are focused around shared objectives across all delivery stakeholders to release reliable software repeatedly. There is a focus on collaboration. There is a focus ultimately on facilitating that collaboration via automation. And that leads to the fact that DevOps is supported through technical practices practices, not all technical, such as agile, continuous integration, and continuous delivery. But at the end of the day, I love what one of my former colleagues used to say here at CloudBees, you don't do DevOps, right? You can do continuous delivery, and you have vendors and practitioners that can help you implement continuous delivery, but DevOps is really about a set of tenets and a culture.
Great. All right. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that, or are we good with what's Brian said?
You guys can all just say wrong right away.
Wrong.
Kidding. We all know it's about the tools, Brian. Come on.
All right, great. Well, then, if you, Brian, you said we're coming to kind of this common understanding, if you will, or we're all kind of meeting in the middle or migrating there. But why do you think we need? Maybe Sunil, maybe you can answer this one. But why do we need that common understanding? I mean, do you think that this will kind of help spur adoption, or what's the big idea there?
That's a great question, Charlene. As Brian mentioned, just adopting a DevOps tool doesn't really mean that you have DevOps. There's really a lot of culture involved, and there's also the whole forest versus the trees phenomenon. You can learn all about the tools, you can, but unless you really understand the overall overarching goal that you're trying to achieve and why these tools need to interact and what's the best practices around it, you really don't get the most benefit out of it, right? And the other thing is that DevOps really needs buy-in from all different parts of the organization, all the way from the CIO to different business groups, etc. So there are multiple tools in play. There are multiple stakeholders in play. There is the whole agile shift. There is organization structure involved. There's so many moving parts in here. So unless and until you have a very clear definition of each of these parts and how they actually work, in a very generic way that can be defined, often what happens is organizations can end up having tool exhaustion because they see so much of it and it's overwhelming, right? So in order to kind of manage that, I think a clear understanding is really, really important. And once we have that, people are going to kind of take on this at a much faster pace, leading to a much broader adoption.
Okay, all right. Anything to add there, guys?
Yeah,
I think it makes total sense.
A common definition is important because what I've seen often, especially in an enterprise where communication and collaboration hasn't been well established, you get 5 different teams marching off to implement DevOps because they heard their manager was interested in it or the CIO wanted to implement DevOps, but they're each pursuing definitions of DevOps that are informed by their perspective in the life cycle. So it's important that before you start implementation, ideally, you are arriving at that common definition.
All right, great. So Carl, then, I'm going to put you in the hot seat here for a second. So what do you see as some of the greatest benefits that practitioners are experiencing today then?
Yeah, in the beginning, it was mostly philosophical and academic, but then the State of the DevOps report happened, and we started to get some real numbers and learning how people actually, how DevOps actually affects their organization, and particularly the practitioners themselves. And what we've learned is that for high-performing organizations that fully embrace DevOps practices and cultures, we see 200 times more frequent deployments. We see 2,500 times shorter lead times, which sounds like a ridiculous number, but it's true. 3 times lower change failure rates. They recover from failure 24 times faster. And all that's great. It makes your company better. It makes you better at your job. It makes your customers happier. But the thing that I like most about that is that the practitioners are 2.2 times more likely to recommend their organization to their peers. And that really speaks a lot to their happiness, right? Like DevOps just makes your life better as a practitioner. It makes you happier. It makes you not hate your job and your day-to-day as much. And it gives you your weekends back, which means more time with your family. Like it really is that kind of profound.
Well, it sounds like all wine and roses, but I'm sure there are some hurdles. So, Lubosh, what do you see as kind of the major hurdles that that organizations are facing there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll kind of riff off of what Brian was saying, in that when I talk to customers, often the real fundamental cultural and process changes that are required are the things that trip organizations up the most. And I think it's easy for us to forget how long people in these large organizations have been working in these very siloed organizations with very different processes and very different goals and objectives from each other. And so I think we need to, I think everybody needs to really think about, well, how do we effectively change a larger organization, right? How do we go through that? Sauce Labs, we're very involved in testing, so I'll use a testing example. But often as you're making that DevOps journey, you're trying to get to CI and CD. You're going to need to fundamentally change how quality interacts with development, right? And how they day-to-day work, moving from a sequential kind of waterfall methodology to something more agile, and that's really different. And helping them make that transition is important. What I've seen large organizations do successfully when they do DevOps successfully, when they do CI/CD successfully, is to plan that change out, right? It's not just, just telling people, hey, this is what I want you to do is not enough. They really require, training, often retraining. And so, some of our customers have thought way ahead and said, hey, we need to bring in, some consultants, some experts, give our teams the training, help them with the organizational changes so that they can be successful. And that's what I think is and honestly, I think that is the best approach. You really, especially in a larger organization, without that training, that retraining, without providing the necessary new structures, it's really difficult for individuals to be successful. And I think we do need to be really appreciative of just the magnitude of changes that we're asking people to make. So that I think is one of the biggest things. I think, as we mentioned, I think the tooling will actually, of course, help with all this, but it's I don't see it as the number one barrier we face.
Okay, great.
And I
So
just
Go ahead.
wanted to add something to what Libos, and I totally agree. And I think, I was having a conversation the other day, and someone was saying, like, is your DevOps project over? I said it's never a project, right? It's a journey. It's multiple projects that you plan out, and I think that is very important for organizations to really realize to make it effective.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. So when you come to that realization that it's not a project, that it is a journey, I imagine a lot of that and that acceptance within the organization has to do with that kind of culture shift that has to take place. And once that happens, DevOps becomes a much easier thing for companies to embrace, and they begin to see a lot more of the positive aspects of DevOps rather than this being a huge disruptive thing that they have to overcome. So Anand, when you're talking to organizations that are really kind of hitting the mark when it comes to DevOps and that kind of that cultural aspect, what are you seeing out there? I mean, what's kind of that tipping point there for a lot of them?
Sure. I mean, as you could just hear from everyone, starting with Brian, when he started talking about defining or definition of DevOps, he touched on culture, and actually everyone, Sunil, Lubos, Carl, everyone touched on culture. It's so important. So in order to succeed in the kind of cultural aspect of DevOps transformation, I think organizations need to focus on increased communication, collaboration, and transparency. I think these are the three key areas that they need to focus on. As we know that the dev teams are typically measured on speed and throughput, and ops team are measured on stability, right? And
Mhm.
testing and release management teams somehow kind of often get caught between the crossfire between dev and ops, right? So in this world of DevOps, understanding the dependencies and hands-off between different phases of software lifecycle and understanding the metrics of success in this DevOps world becomes very, very important. So it's not only kind of about co-locating dev and ops teams together, but it means, I think Lobos touched on that, it means reskilling them, understanding each other's roles, needs, retraining them to enable collaboration is key. And we have seen successes. Carl talked about the DevOps State of DevOps report. And one of the things that came out that those high-performing organizations, employees are happier. When they kind of enabled and retrained their employees for collaboration, they were happier. I mean, they were kind of more likely to suggest that that their company is a better company to work for, and things like that. So I think it is very, very important for companies to focus on increased communication, collaboration, and transparency.
Yeah, it's really moving toward that high trust culture. We found that when you have a lot of process and a lot of bureaucracy and everything is a ticket handoff, and there's not a lot of active collaboration and active trust in the process or in your peers' abilities, that ends up making you distrustful of the process overall. It makes you have less faith that this change is going to actually work. And it makes you have less faith and have more animosity toward the other teams that you work with, which slows everything down, causes failure, yada, yada, we know the story. It's that moving to that high trust culture that really, really matters. And you know, that takes more than just saying, hey, by the way, we trust everybody now, you know, be a kumbaya. You have to have a plan for doing that. You have to understand the cultural implications and how to attack that.
Yeah, I'd just like to, if I may, Charlene, just add real quick that when we've surveyed and asked people what they found their biggest obstacle was from going from a sort of a waterfall organization to an enterprise DevOps or CD organization, the number one response was culture. The number two, just slightly behind culture, were tools and technology, so sort of tooling and architecture. And then process was really the smaller. People feel like they could define process. However, bringing people along to want to follow that process and make it effective requires some of the things that Anand and Carl just mentioned. But then you also, though, you know, I don't want to negate the power of tools and automation, right? At the end of the day, even when we talk collaboration, you know, or chat ops, for instance, we need solutions to support that ongoing frequency of communication. So I did want to add that. And then I have one big word that I think is critical in terms of culture and implementing DevOps. You guys hit on indirectly, and it's empathy, right? You need to develop empathy up and down your organization and across what may have in the past been silos within your organization.
Interesting. I don't hear that word being used too much in DevOps. So, but maybe that's something we should all start using a little bit more. Interesting. Yeah, Brian, you touched on tools and technologies and processes, and that's actually a perfect segue for my next question for you, which was, when we're talking about DevOps, does it have to be continuous integration and continuous delivery, or can it be continuous integration or continuous delivery?
Well,
Are they
first
one and the
I'm
same?
going to say that if we really want to be purists, it doesn't have to be any of those, right? We go, right?
Okay.
We go back to the top and we talk about the definition of DevOps. You know, technically, actually, I love, you know, Jez Humble sort of said, well, DevOps requires automation. Automation doesn't require a tool. We can all do it with bash scripts, right? And I'll sort of carry that forward, right? We can collaborate. We can achieve transparency. We can have cross-group or cross-functional empathy to align us towards delivering reliable quality software repeatedly without CI or CD. But we probably won't be able to sustain that. So what I'm going to say is that it is CI and CD. Right now, look at CI, or continuous integration, as sort of being the start of rapidly integrating changes and sort of embodying the concept of fail fast, right? And I think that is critical overall to the concept of DevOps. However, when we talk about the idea of the need to extend upstream development into downstream delivery in a continuous manner, sort of to borrow from Gene Kim, with systems thinking and continuous flow, is then going to require that we extend those principles of continuous integration to include full functional testing, deployment, and basically every step that we can automate to ensure that what we are sending downstream is ready. So, you know, long answer to short answer, DevOps is neither CI or CD, but I think to be successful and make DevOps movement within your organization sustainable, you need to implement quality and automation via CI and CD respectively.
Interesting. Anybody have any comments about that? Or is everybody good with what Brian said?
I'll just chime in that, you know, when people look at, DevOps, I think one of the fundamental things they're looking for is increased velocity, and to really get those speed improvements, it's difficult to do that without the automation.
Yeah, I think the big piece there is where do you start, and how do you look at that optimization? So CI is a local optimization. It's an optimization for your developers. It's an optimization for your engineering team. It's not an optimization for your company. Continuous delivery is extending that out and saying we're going to optimize the entire product delivery process. But there's two things to that. If you look at how you're developing and deploying your software, and it takes you 5 months to develop the software, catch all the bugs, go through all the iterations, get it what you think is ready, which you're probably wrong, and then take a week to get it out. your deployment isn't your biggest problem there. It's a big problem. It shouldn't take you a week to deploy software, but that's not your biggest problem. That's where you need to go back and say, like, yes, we do need to optimize the engineering side and get it down into smaller batches, be able to fail faster, get that transparency and therefore empathy, by the way, and then worry about the deployment side of things. But I've absolutely seen organizations where they are, automated testing is not their biggest problem. Where they do need to optimize their deployment first, and then do manual testing up front, and then work backwards to optimize the beginning part of the pipeline. You absolutely want automation through and through. You're not going to get there on day one, and understanding which one you need to attack first is critical.
Okay, great. Well, okay, so then if going down that road, then when we're looking at the different types of tools and tooling and technologies, Sunil, what do you see as kind of those fundamental building blocks then?
Sure. So I think, as Brian and Carl just mentioned, right? So, cycle time is one of the most important parameters to kind of measure, and to speed up cycle time is really the eventual goal of DevOps. And there are different aspects of DevOps which can be optimized for the same. So if you look at tools, essentially, at the minimum, you need some kind of an orchestration layer, right? So which manages the entire pipeline. Could be CloudBees, Jenkins, or any of the orchestration tools that exist. And then you have a lot of the existing, source code management systems on the very left. It could be Git, SVN, or what you may. And these are typically in organizations already used in many different forms, but they form an important component of your DevOps pipeline. Then you follow on with a lot of unit testing tools, static code analysis tools, code coverage tools, and the actual tools vary depending on technology. But essentially, this is a fundamental building block also of the entire DevOps pipeline. And then of course you have the build tools, right? So these exist in script forms, or they could be fully automated in some way. And these need to be tied into your orchestration layer, so they run as part of the pipeline. And one of the important aspects of DevOps, which often people don't think about, but it's very important, is the whole repository, right? So you need to have artifact repositories where you can actually store the right artifacts, and you'll be amazed as to how many times builds fail just because they got the wrong DLLs in the system, right? So managing entire versioning that, having a good Artifactory repository like Artifactory, maybe, or Nexus, etc., are very important. That's the next building block. And then you have automation of your testing, right? So, the existing test automation for system tests, for end-to-end testing, need to be kind of hooked into your pipeline. So that's a very, very important part of the DevOps pipeline. And then eventually you need to think about deployments. As Carl mentioned, right? Maybe the need might be to optimize the deployment, and more often than not, that is a very important piece of getting your DevOps chain really, really working well for your cycle time, is to get deployment tools in place, right? There could be config management tools like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, containerizations, containers like Docker, etc. Where you need to kind of plan out and see what is my deployment strategy. So that's another big building block. And then you have all this in place. You need to have a good slew of tools to really manage the ops piece of it, is to kind of have monitoring in place, right? So you need to really monitor the process and see, okay, is everything working fine? Is it really optimized the way we need it for our purposes? What else should we do in terms of environment management, etc.? So that's the entire ops tool. And last but not the least, if all this exists, but there is no way to kind of report on it, it's not really useful, right? So you need to have a good dashboarding tools, to really see how your entire DevOps pipeline is functioning over a period of time. So I would say these today exist in organization different pieces, but these would form the fundamental building blocks of our entire DevOps pipeline, when you bring it all together.
Great. Do you miss anything? Anyone? We're good?
Yeah, I think this is Janand. This work that we're doing under DevOps Express work group called Best Practices is also documented and published now at DevOpsExpress.com. So DevOps-express.com. And anyone could go. I highly encourage that you could go and look at the different phases and the whole ecosystem that we believe that is out there, and provide us feedback. I think that's one place where you could go and look up for more information on that.
Oh, That's handy. All right. Great. So just doing a quick time check. We're at about 30 minutes past the hour. I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to get your question in at any time, and we're going to take about 15 minutes or so near the end of the presentation to answer audience questions. Okay, so moving along. Carl, I've been hearing a lot about infrastructure as a code. So can you talk a little bit about the role that it plays in DevOps?
Yeah, a foundational one. So it's critical to a lot of the DevOps practices that we've been talking about today. So we've talked about version control. Peer review is something that's absolutely critical to DevOps, and it's part of that collaboration process and catching problems closer to the keyboard. Automated testing and sharing. All of those things are enabled by infrastructure as code. The great thing about infrastructure as code is that it's portable, right? It's code. It's the thing that we've always been shipping. So we can take all of the practices that we've been doing for decades and apply it to our actual infrastructure. It's not infrastructure code. It's treating your infrastructure as if it were code. And that's really powerful concept. It enables things like fast feedback, collaboration, tight iteration, and then continuous delivery. It's really easy to think that you can take a lot of the manual things that you're doing today, and perhaps some of the graphical tools that you're using, and think that you can just replicate a lot of that into a continuous delivery pipeline. But when you have infrastructure as code, it's much easier to, say, codify a process or a decision that you've made about your infrastructure, and then put that into version control and promote it from one environment to the next, and have it be repeatable, so you can trust that it's going to work as you move from one to the next. So I really recommend infrastructure as code is basically the foundational starting place when you start looking at where to get started to enable a lot of these practices. Yeah.
Great. Go ahead.
Oh, I just like to add that I think merging Sunil's response and Carl's response, something that's often overlooked when people look to tackle or implement continuous delivery is the need. I don't necessarily want to say like environments, but the need for rapid and consistent access to the environments that we used to only have available downstream, upstream. We could automate all we want via continuous delivery upstream, but if we're not ultimately validating in a reasonable production proximity or a production-like environment, then we're going to run into the same old problems when we go to deploy. And I just like to tie back, talking building blocks. This is one of the things that that makes being able to apply software development best practices to your infrastructure by infrastructure as code really important, because now we're able to carry through what our ultimate sort of resting place or environment will look like, all the way shift it left in the pipeline and carry it through as we develop. Like environments and rapid access to like environments, I think, is really important for continuous delivery.
And just to expand on that just a little bit more, one of the things that we're seeing at Puppet is what I call scaling expertise using infrastructure as code. If you are an expert in a piece of technology, it's really easy with infrastructure as code for you to codify your expertise and for you to describe the way that you manage that technology, and then provide simple abstractions for other people to consume. And a big part of DevOps culture is about sharing. Well, that means that I can share my expertise in a very low touch way, and anyone can replicate my expertise within their environment very, very rapidly without me having to actually be there to look over their shoulder and help them out. I can just say, here's this one thing that I've made, a tool that I've made using infrastructure as code, and you can just replicate what I do already.
Wow. Okay. Great. So then, it sounds, I guess, at first glance, it sounds pretty easy, but I imagine that there are some difficulties, in implementing this from a technical implementation standpoint. Luboš, where do you see organizations struggling?
One of the, Sauce Labs as a testing vendor, one of the areas, of course, that I hear a lot about is how do organizations move and really dramatically change their testing as they move from waterfall to agile and DevOps. And one of the misconceptions that we often see people struggle with is as they just start this journey is that they'll have a whole set of kind of legacy test scripts that they want to go ahead and reuse, and I often actually find the term automated testing be a little bit misleading. I almost like the term continuous testing better because it better describes kind of a fundamental change that needs to happen as people rework their test suites to be much more autonomous and atomic, so that they can continue to test throughout their whole pipeline. So whether it's on every PR, there'll be a certain amount of pull requests that you'll want to testing that you'll want to do before you merge. They'll want to later on as you move down the pipeline, you'll want to do more more full regression on your application. And then finally, you may actually want to take that testing all the way into production to do some checks on a continual basis. And so one of the things that we often talk to customers about is how to rewrite your tests, how to move your tests into a way that will support this idea of continuous testing throughout your pipeline, and make sure that they're easier to maintain, more robust over time. So that's one of the main areas that we talk to customers about.
Great. So talking a little bit about, and I want to go back to DevOps Express that you had mentioned earlier. It's great that we have these organizations such as that, and so yeah, I'm wondering if we can just kind of expand on that a little bit, and maybe you can talk a little bit about why you think it's so important that the tools vendors actually collaborate via something like DevOps Express. I mean, how do you think that furthers the industry and maybe help with the technical adoption and implementation?
Sure. Yeah, so DevOps Express is a consortium initiative comprised of leading vendors and practitioners with a goal to establish and expand a community for learning and sharing solution-oriented knowledge and best practices. So the goal here is to operationalize the path to DevOps for practitioners. So focus is practitioners, and the way we are kind of planning to do is providing solution-oriented guidance that enables practitioners to accelerate adoption through proven DevOps architecture, best practices, and I'll talk about how we are structured to deliver on that. Also, advancement of interoperable tooling. We talked about different phases of software lifecycle, from planning to development to testing to release to monitor and manage. But kind of we are focusing on interoperable tooling, the stack, with direct support from member organizations. We have leading vendors here who provide different tools in the entire software lifecycle, as well as kind of creating a community and mechanism for feedback from practitioners. And so we're talking with a lot of practitioners, and the idea here is to enable a channel, enable a mechanism, a platform to enable the communication, get feedback based on the knowledge that we have as vendor organizations working with different customers, take those best practices and offer that. But again, use that as a starting point and collect feedback and enhance on that. So the way we are structured to deliver on our goals is we have 5 work streams, if you will. The first one is what we call best practices work group, and that's where actually many of us in the webinar today, Brian, Sunil, Carl, and I participate in. And the goal here is to kind of document the best practices, the reference architectures, demos, articles. One of the first deliverable out of this work group is the DevOps ecosystem that Sunil was talking about, and it's published now that you could download and look at, and of course provide feedback so that we could add and enhance to that. So that's the first work group. The second one, we call it interoperability work group, and the idea here is to come up with proven stack, proven tools and how they work together, so that like many times when we talk about DevOps, the challenge many of these customers have and that I have heard of is like, where do we start? So if they already have a starting point, a proven architecture, a proven stack, it's easier. And then of course there are a lot of learnings and best practices are out there that we are compiling based on those proven stacks. So that's the second one, interoperability work group. Third one is what we call support work group. And the idea here is to provide support for this integrated solutions. We are talking about multiple solutions. Some of the tools are interchangeable, but the idea here is that customers who are starting on their DevOps journey or already have deployed a way to give them support for the integrated solution, rather than kind of them going to multiple different places and then trying to kind of get roadblocks and the dependencies between different tools. The idea here is to provide that integrated support. And then finally, the fourth one is the work group is around what we call go-to-market work group. And the idea here is to take all the good work that's different work groups are doing, the best practices, interoperability and support, take that to market, take that to in a consumable form, in infographics, in documents, in white paper. We have just launched our new web page that was done by this work group, go-to-market work group. The website is at DevOps-Express.com. You could go look at the information and resources, as well as some of the deliverables that we have. So these are the four key work groups that we have. And then finally, the fifth one is around governance, kind of making sure, what are the processes, what are the charter, the budget, continuous monitoring of our progress, setting up the face-to-face meeting to enable the collaboration between the members and practitioners. So that's the structure, and the goal that we have is to enable the community, come up with a platform and channel where we could work with practitioners with a goal to operationalize the path to DevOps for practitioners. I mean, it was a long-winded answer, but I just wanted to kind of provide the details. And I invite our members over here to add anything if I missed.
I don't know, that's a pretty good explanation.
So, and it's DevOps-Express.com, the
That's
site?
right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, I encourage the audience to check it out. So we're running up it's about 1:42 Eastern right now. So we have time for a couple more questions. And again, would like to encourage the audience, if you have any questions for Brian and Neil, Sunil, Arnand, Sunil, Carl, or Lubash, please feel free to get them in. We have plenty of questions on our end too, so let's dive right back into it. So Brian, Anand mentioned on the DevOps Express consortium, the information on how to start implementing DevOps. I'd like to hear it from you. What is the best way to get started implementing DevOps?
Okay. Then, as usual, I'm going to color my answer before I answer. I'm going to say there's no one size fits all. I'd be fooling you to come in and say this is absolutely the best place for your organization to start. A lot of it is going to depend on where you are in terms of maturity. Where are your pain points? What needs to be addressed? Going back to what Anand said, we do hope. With our interoperability work, sort of having tools that work together with support and reference architecture, as well as best practices and patterns work we're working on, will allow you to be able to choose and select. In general, now that I've qualified it, what I would say is the best place to start is developing that empathy that I talked about. It is recognizing that DevOps involves all stakeholders in the process, not just one guy that is really stoked about Puppet and he's the Puppet dude and he's your DevOps guy, but rather it's understanding that it's about flow, it's about pipeline, bringing all the stakeholders to the table, developing empathy, not saying we're implementing DevOps, not saying we're implementing continuous delivery, not even saying we're implementing TDD or infrastructure as code, but rather identifying what is it that we do good today, where do we need to improve, gaining alignment on those areas that you need to improve on, and then developing a plan to get there. And I would say that one of the best places to start from there is to identify an existing project, ideally high value, low risk, or a greenfield project with people that are forward looking and innovative, and begin on a single team to sort of begin that pilot of taking the steps towards addressing where you guys have agreed that you have needs. I recommend you make that team cross-functional, and to support a cross-functional team in collaboration, you should at the same time be seeking to implement a unified or unifying tools and technology. Basically the automation and the integration that is going to facilitate collaboration amongst this cross-functional team, which becomes the test bed or the pilot for the practices that you will ultimately want to promote and propagate across the organization.
All right. Anybody have anything to add to that? That was a pretty extensive. Oh, I said extensive. I didn't say long. There's a difference there.
Big plus one to it. For the listeners, I'd recommend you look at Gene Kim's 3 Ways. Brian mentioned Gene Kim's 3 Ways earlier. Definitely something to read about and understand how you start thinking, how you get to systems thinking, and where you actually start with that process.
That's a good point there. Okay, then, so let's move on to this idea of a maturity model in DevOps, which I'm sure is kind of a subjective thing as well. But Sunil, can you kind of walk us through, like, what is a maturity model in the context of DevOps?
Sure, absolutely. So I think as we've been talking about for the past 40 minutes or so, there is no real single definition of an ideal state of DevOps, and there is not a single place that every organization can kind of start from. So what really happens in any organization is that they may have different components of DevOps already in place, being run for quite some time in very disjoint fashion though. So a maturity model really helps assess where the organization is with respect to different aspects of DevOps, right? Could be, the test automation piece, with their build piece, the orchestration layer piece, the reporting piece, the ops piece, and help figure out that, okay, this is where they are, this is what the current looks like, and what the future could ideally look like for them, for that particular organization, and what is the path to kind of reach there. So that is what essentially a maturity model in the context of DevOps would be, is that to figure out different components of DevOps and where they are, and what are the areas that can immediately be optimized, the low-hanging fruits, if you will, and what are the areas which could be put in a long-term strategy. For example, an organization might decide that, okay, we're starting off with a very small team, just doing CI for now, and they can decide to either extend that and make it a CI, extend CI to do CD, or they could decide to actually roll that out into further different groups in the organization and do a lot more CI, and then reach enterprise CI. So there are different paths to kind of reaching the final kind of a state of maturity. So essentially, just to sum it up, essentially with DevOps being a journey and then having so many different moving parts, a DevOps maturity model really, gives a very quantifiable, a very systematic way of kind of evaluating, the state of an organization with respect to DevOps.
Great, excellent. Anything to add to that, guys? Anyone? Okay. All right. Well, that's a good thing. We are just taking a look here at the time. We're about 12 minutes to the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and keep rolling here. Carl, I'm interested in finding out about some best practices in the industry and maybe some of the workflows. Where they might be located that maybe practitioners can kind of use them to leverage in their own efforts. So can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that is often missing when organizations start to look at workflows is how they feed it back into the requirements gathering process. So for example, we start off with a ticket that says we're going to build this feature. It's great. It's going to change the world. And then we give it to the developers and they start working on code, and then they put that into the pipeline. And we measure that pipeline from the build to upload to Artifactory to automated testing to deployment. But we miss giving that feedback all the way back to the ticket and saying, here's the status of this work. Here is where this thing is, and giving that visibility back into the outside of engineering, to the project managers, to the product managers, so that they can understand what their velocity is, where their team is at in their march towards this vision that they want to deliver. So that part's really critical. The other piece of it is at the end when you get into monitoring. And when you combine continuous delivery with continuous monitoring, that's when things get really, really interesting. So having a process of once we deploy, also getting that into what we want to monitor, not just the performance, like application performance monitoring, but also what are the metrics, the business metrics that we want to measure for this feature. How do we think this thing is going to perform? What is the engagement going to be like? Getting that data into your monitoring as well. And then again, feeding that back into the beginning of the pipeline into your product managers, and so that they can make rapid decisions and change things if necessary. If done right, you get a couple of things, you get a couple of advantages. One, the teams can identify problems much earlier on because they're looking at that continuous monitoring data coming in, and they're able to rapidly change and make changes, or rather identify changes. Then if you're using continuous delivery, you can do small batch iterations to very quickly make those changes and quickly see if your measurements are changing as you deploy, right? So you can quickly react and know if you were right. The other piece of that is how it folds back into the agile process for product management. When you combine continuous monitoring and continuous delivery, as well as matching everything back to your requirements gathering, you don't just change IT, you change who you are as a company. Now you can do experiments faster. You can do rapid, you can innovate quicker. You can learn from the market faster, and then you can react to that. So combining all of those different workflows, all those different practices into a coherent workflow is really, really important, and will absolutely change the way you create software.
Interesting. So I imagine it's. I mean, obviously there's a framework there, but it's not a one size fits all. I imagine. I mean, each company has its own set of best practices for what works for that company, and how they measure themselves. When they're successful, when they've achieved what they want to. That's really kind of thank you for that explanation. That's a great explanation. Moving on to automation, though, I'm hearing a lot about that as well. Lubosh, how important is automation to DevOps? I mean, is it a critical element, or is it something that's kind of a nice to have, or where does it stand on the spectrum?
Yeah, I definitely see automation as a critical element for a couple different reasons. First of all, simply from a collaboration perspective, having a common set of automation tools that dev, QA, operations all agree on is important as part of that collaboration process. Eliminates friction, gives everyone the same set of information, helps with the common goals. When we talk to customers, one of the key things, of course, is simply speed and repeatability. I like a lot about what Carl mentioned in terms of codifying things and learning. And so as you through the automation, you continue to optimize your process, and any learnings go right back into that automation. But speed is also really important. Our customers are definitely looking to get their applications to market faster, and specifically as it regards to testing. Automation is critical. You cannot get the type of coverage you need in the time required unless you can scale your testing and do that extremely rapidly. And so for those reasons, I see it as really important. I think it's a fundamental aspect for sure.
Great. Anybody have anything to add there? All right, great.
I mean,
Brian,
right.
I think you lost your audio. Are you with us? Oh, there you are.
Yeah, no, I
Welcome back.
am here, the classic
No
talk
wonder
on mute.
it's so quiet. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I guess I'll try to reconcile that back to a comment that I made earlier, that when we say, DevOps is really about culture and practices in and of itself, I don't think it dictates that you automate. But again, to Lobos's point, to achieve what we want to achieve with DevOps, repeatability, speed, as people have noted, automation is critical. So yeah, I just wanted to reconcile it. I'll go back on mute now.
No, please don't.
I would like to add as well. I mean, pretty much, agree with both the comments. But the goal for the reason that we are doing DevOps and why it is becoming more important is the speed, quality, cost, and user experience improvement. All of that is really important, and automation is key for that. When you add manual things or continue to do manual activities, the chances of failures are higher and quality is impacted. So automation is definitely key to kind of and it aligns with the goals that we are trying to achieve with that DevOps methodologies and practices.
Yeah, I imagine it also cuts down on fat finger mistakes and things like that, introducing the human error. So,
yeah,
all right.
And just go back to kind of what Carl was mentioning in terms of feedback loops and workflows. I really think definitely even internally as Sauce Labs, what we've seen is that automation and bringing that feedback automatically to all the different stakeholders really helps with the collaboration, when everybody can see, when it's not only ops saying like, hey, this is a problem, but quality and dev sees it's a problem also, and seeing that in a very timely fashion can really help.
All right, great. We've got about 3 minutes left until the top of the hour, so I think we have time for one more question. Real quick, Anand, if somebody is interested, practitioners are interested in getting involved in DevOps Express, how would they go about doing that?
So I think that the first and easiest thing is to go to the web page and sign up for more information. There's a sign up button, and that's the best way to kind of get started at this phase of DevOps Express, when we are still kind of forming our different work groups and trying to kind of work together. Another way is that we are working on a webcast pretty much similar to this with practitioners, with customers who are have already deployed and benefited from DevOps. And so if you're interested, if you have a good story to tell, again, let us know from the web page. That's another important part. Finally, we believe that in a few months or so, we'll be ready to invite practitioners to participate and join the consortium in some form to participate and actively, by providing feedback, writing blogs, doing webinars, and just contributing to the best practices, because it's all about the learning from the field and how they are kind of benefiting from them, the metrics that they measured and benefited from all of that. So I think at this time, the best way to sign up for more information, offer help through by contacting us through the webpage. But pretty soon in the upcoming months, we'll open it up for more direct participation from practitioners.
Great. Well, that's great. I'm sure the audience will check it out if they haven't already. And I'm afraid we are come to pretty much the end of our question and answer period. But this was a great conversation. I sure got a lot out of it, and I'm sure our audience members did as well. I do want to remind everybody that if you missed any or all of this webinar, it is being recorded and will be available about 24 hours from now. So you can check the DevOps.com website. You can also you'll also receive a link to the recording by email sometime in the next 24 hours or so. But also check the DevOps.com website for upcoming webinars. We've got some really interesting ones coming down the pike. And I know, guys, we could continue this conversation for at least another hour, I'm sure. we'll have to do this again another time. It's been a lot of fun. Brian Dawson, Ananda Keela, Sunil, I forgot your last name, Sunil Pillai, I'm sorry. Carl Combe and Lubosh Parabek. Thank you all very much for joining me today on this webinar, What is DevOps? Defining an Industry Standard. Thank you again for everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Thanks again.
All right.